Today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories that are all connected under the theme of stranger than fiction. But they really couldn't be more different from each other. I mean, these are 3 very diverse stories, ranging from almost comical to very dark. But regardless, I know you're going to like them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please follow the like button to the grocery store, and every time they're not looking, secretly steal items from their cart. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One morning in October of 2015, a receptionist sat at her desk at a sports medicine center in Birmingham, Alabama, and scrolled through her boss's upcoming surgery schedule on her computer. The receptionist worked for a famous orthopedic surgeon named Dr. James Andrews, and because of his notoriety, his schedule was typically packed. And so her job, for the most part, was just to go through his schedule all the time and make sure nothing conflicted. And so as this receptionist scrolled through the schedule, she saw that over the next couple of days that Dr. Andrews did have several surgeries and there actually didn't appear to be any conflicts. And so she began moving on to the next part of her job, which was to alert upcoming surgery patients about their upcoming surgery and to make sure that all their information and the timing of the procedure were all in line with whatever they were expecting. And so the next person up to get surgery by Dr. Andrews was this minor league baseball player whose name was Brady Feigl, and he was having an elbow surgery, and he was supposed to come in the following morning. So the receptionist called the number on file for Brady, but it actually wasn't Brady's phone number. It was Brady's baseball team's athletic trainer. And so, this guy picks up the phone and the receptionist says, "Hey, just so you know, Brady has a surgery tomorrow morning. It's his elbow surgery. Just trying to confirm the details and make sure he understands what he needs to do to prep for it, etc., etc." And so after she ran through her spiel, the trainer just kind of paused for a second and there was silence on the line. And then the trainer said to the receptionist, there's got to be a mistake here because Brady already had that surgery. He said Brady had gotten it done 6 months earlier, and as a result of the surgery, had to sit out basically the entire baseball season. So there was no mistaking it. He had had the surgery, it was done. But the receptionist, as she's hearing this, she's like, no, that doesn't make any sense. Because the receptionist actually remembered Brady Feigl. He had come in recently for his consultation for this elbow surgery, and he was a really unique looking guy. I mean, he's 6'4", he had bright red hair, a big beard, and also he is a professional baseball player. Like, this is a unique guy that's coming in for a unique surgery that's related to baseball. And so the receptionist is like, no, he came in recently for his consultation. He still needs the surgery, I'm sure of it. And so what ended up happening next is the receptionist and the trainer started going back and forth, kind of trying to describe Brady Feigl to make sure they both were talking about the same person. But of course they were, because how many 6'4", professional baseball player pitchers with this particular elbow problem that were coming to this clinic for an elbow surgery were there? This had to be the same guy. But how could they both be right? That the trainer's saying, well, my Brady Feigl already got it done. And the receptionist is like, no, he's scheduled to come in tomorrow because I had a consultation with him a couple of days ago. They couldn't both be right, but they couldn't understand how this could be possible. But the explanation for this that they did eventually figure out, you just have to see to believe. It would turn out the receptionist and the trainer were both right. Dr. James Andrews was scheduled to perform an elbow surgery on a 6'4", red-haired, big-bearded minor league pitcher named Brady Feigl the following morning. And Dr. James Andrews had also performed the same surgery on another 6'4", red-haired, big-bearded Brady Feigl, who also was a minor league baseball player, also a pitcher, who hurt his elbow months earlier. There were literally 2 Brady Feigls that didn't know each other, that looked the same, did the same sort of really unique job, minor league baseball player, that also went to the same clinic to get the same surgery at roughly the same time. But somehow or another, the clinic put the wrong contact information for the wrong Brady. And so the guy who was supposed to get surgery the next day they accidentally put in the contact info for the other Brady Feigl because they confused them, because they look exactly the same and they have the same name and they're getting the same surgery. So you can see how the mistake happened. And so it was not until this surgery mix-up that the two Brady Feigls learned the other existed. They did not know each other. And when they met each other, I mean, they're spitting images of each other and they do the same job and they have the same issue with their elbow. I mean, it was like this incredible coincidence. But believe it or not, they did do a DNA test because they're thinking we've got to be related, right? Nope, they're not related. They are just absolutely perfect doppelgangers. Hey guys, just want to remind you that year-round we have amazing MrBallen merch available all the time. It does not sell out. It's called Ballin Basics. You can get it at shopmrballen.com. These are different than the unique drops we do periodically. Ballin Basics, again, available 24/7, are things like our skeleton hoodie and t-shirt, our flannel blanket, all the stickers we have. There's a bunch of cool stuff, and it's available right now at shopmrballen.com. All year, you can get this stuff, some great stuff. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you don't gotta wait for the seasonal drops. You can go right now and get anything you want at shopmrballen.com. Year-round, it's available. Ballin Basics, check it out. Around 1:30 p.m. on January 4th, 2020, a 25-year-old woman named Stav Harari and her boyfriend, whose name was Dean Shoshani, looked out the window of their apartment, which was located in Tel Aviv, Israel. Their apartment was located on the top floor of a brand new complex, and from that position, they had a great view of the whole neighborhood, at least normally. But today, their view was pretty much completely obscured, because there was this horrible thunderstorm outside. Tons of rain and hail. I mean, they could barely look out their window. It was just like water and hail blasting against the glass. And so Stav and Dean, they look at each other, and it's pretty clear both of them are thinking the same thing. So this couple, they've been together since they were super young, and they really had just begun to transition into adulthood together. And so in this transitional time, they were just starting to make real money, but they really didn't have a lot of money. They'd put a lot of whatever they had into this apartment, and they also had recently purchased a car. And so the two of them, as they're looking at each other, they're thinking about that car, their investment. And with this huge storm out there, there's a chance the storm could damage that car. And they couldn't have that. They didn't have the money to fix it. Like, they needed that car. And so they both were like, you know what? Let's go down to the parking lot and move the car just to make sure it does not get damaged. So Dean grabbed the car keys, and then he and Stav left their apartment, went into the hallway, and walked down to the elevator. They pressed the down button, and then a moment later, the elevator car opened up. There was nobody inside. Stav and Dean stepped in. They hit the button that would bring them down to the parking lot, and then the doors closed, and the elevator began to go down. And as they were going down, Stav and Dean were quiet, just sort of waiting, anxious to see if their car had already been damaged. They didn't know. And so down it went, top floor again, so it's kind of a long ride, and they get really close to the floor they're waiting to get off at, when suddenly the car kind of comes to an abrupt stop. And for a second, both Stav and Dean are thinking, okay, well, I guess we must be at the floor. I mean, this is about where we should have stopped anyways. And the two of them are just staring at the doors, waiting for them to open up. But they don't. And after what felt like too long of a waiting period for the doors not to open, Stav reached out and hit the button that opens up the doors. But when she pressed the door open button, they didn't open. Nothing happened. At this point, Stav began to panic, and she turned to Dean and said, what do we do? We're stuck, we're trapped. But Dean said, don't worry about it. It's fine. It's probably just some small malfunction. It'll start working again soon, no big deal. But within seconds of that exchange, the two of them heard a very familiar sound. And when they looked at where the sound was coming from, they both began to scream. At the same time this was happening, another resident of this complex, a young man named Eli, happened to be nearby when he heard screaming. And he found out that the screaming was coming from the elevator shaft, and the doors were shut on his side. And so he runs to the doors and he listens, and very clearly, just beyond these doors had to be people who were stuck in the elevator, and they were screaming for help. And so instinctively, Eli grabbed the outside of the elevator and he tried to pry it open, but he just couldn't get them to budge. And the whole time, Stav and Dean on the inside are freaking out, screaming, pleading with someone to get them out. And so Eli, he turns and starts yelling for other people who were also nearby to come over and help. And before long, there was a group of guys over at the elevator doing everything they could with Eli to pry this thing open, but they just couldn't. And the whole time, Stav and Dean are inside sounding more and more desperate. And so Eli finally pulled out his phone and called the emergency services line. However, despite Eli pretty quickly alerting the authorities about this, ongoing crisis here, this elevator issue, it would take over an hour and a half for first responders to finally arrive to the apartment building because of this treacherous storm. There were loads of other problems in the city. But when they finally arrived at Stav and Dean's apartment and they got to the elevator, it was already too late. It would turn out, after Stav and Dean got stuck in the elevator and they're hitting the button, waiting for it to open, but nothing's happening, well, that familiar sound they heard was water rushing into the elevator. They looked down and saw water filling up this space that they can't get out of. And they began to panic and scream and beat on the doors as the water level slowly continued to rise because their parking lot was not outside. It was underground. And the big risk to anybody who parked in this lot is during big storms, this lot was known to flood. And so the couple had gone down to move their car to avoid flooding, not to avoid hail damage. But where this elevator car had stopped was underground. And so the parking lot did begin to flood, and that water found its way into the actual elevator car. And so Eli and those other people who were nearby who went over to the elevator and tried to open it, they were also standing in water. They were very well aware of the fact that if they couldn't open these doors, Stav and Dean are going to drown. And Eli, he didn't call the emergency services line once and call it good. He called 16 times because he's watching as the water is rising and rising and no one's shown up yet. And so eventually, Eli and the others, they had to abandon the elevator and basically swim out of the parking garage as they're listening to the sound of two people, Stav and Dean, still trapped inside of the elevator car. And so as they swam out of the parking garage and no first responders arrived, they knew what had happened. Clearly, they were going to drown. And so they listened to those screams until they stopped. And then finally, first responders showed up. And when they got there, they literally had to use scuba equipment to dive down the elevator shaft, which by this point was totally submerged. And then when they reached the car, they had to cut a hole in the ceiling. And then they pulled Stav and Dean out. And even though they rushed them to the hospital, unfortunately, they both had already died. On the evening of July 2nd, 1993, a 49-year-old politician named Maslin Idris paced around the living room inside of his home, which was located in a suburb of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Maslin was feeling very anxious because tonight, in his home, he was going to have a very important meeting. So Maslin was already a very successful politician. He was a state assemblyman, which is sort of like a state congressperson. But what he really coveted, the thing he wanted more than anything else in his political career, was to become the state's Menteri Besar, which is sort of like being the state's governor. But to get this role, Maslin had to be appointed. And realistically, he didn't know if that was going to happen. And that was in part because recently he had felt like his political power was sort of, slipping away from him. And on top of that, he was getting older and he sort of felt like his popularity was waning too. And so he felt like, in order for me to get appointed to become the state's Menteri Besar, I really need to find a unique way to reclaim that political power and popularity. And that was going to be the central focus of the big meeting at his house that night. And so Maslin continued to pace around, anxiously checking his watch, waiting for these people to show up. And then sure enough, late that night, he heard a knock on the door. And he hustled over to the door and he made sure he looked okay. And then he opened it up. And standing in the hallway is this unbelievably beautiful woman who's flanked by these two men that he didn't know. And immediately, Maslin is just completely drawn to this woman. She had long dark hair, this huge smile, and her eyes, they sucked him in. It was like she was, hypnotizing him or something. She really looked like a celebrity, at least as Maslin imagined celebrities look up close. This woman's name was Mona Fandey, and actually, to some degree, she was a celebrity. Back in the 1980s, she had released a pop music album that had been very popular all over Malaysia, and so she was kind of famous in Malaysia. Now, in the early 1990s, Mona was done singing, that part of her life was over, But she had launched this brand new second career post-music that, to some people, it seemed like that actually made her more notable and more famous than her singing had. These days, Mona was a highly sought-after professional shaman. So in Malaysia at this time, shamanism was pretty popular and mainstream. Shamans were these people who claimed to have supernatural powers. They could heal people and bring them prosperity. And so it wasn't uncommon for the really well-known shamans to be called upon by very powerful people, like, politicians, let's say, to sort of leverage their powers to increase their clout and their influence. And so Maslin saw Mona, who at the time was arguably the most famous shaman in the entire country. He saw her as his meal ticket. She was going to be the way that he reclaimed the power he needed so he could be appointed as the state's Menteri Besar. And so Maslin very excitedly welcomed Mona and the two men, who were her husband and her assistant, into his home. And, even though Maslin had expected to see Mona tonight, he knew she was the one who'd be performing this ritual tonight, he still couldn't help but feel totally starstruck by her. And so as a result, he had a lot of nervous energy, and he began sort of like rapid firing, asking her questions about, how quickly will I see results, and how's this gonna go, and how successful are these things really? And Mona, as she's just looking at him and smiling, she just eventually reaches out as he's talking and just puts her hand on his shoulder and says, "It's okay. Why don't you show my husband and my assistant where the room is, where the space is that we're gonna be doing this ritual tonight?" And at this, Maslin just totally shut up and he nodded. He sort of got the hint that he was sort of being too much here. And he led them into this other room that he had cleared out for tonight. There was nothing on the ground. It was like a vacant room in his house. And right away, the assistant, he began spreading flower petals all over the ground, while Maslin began speaking to Mona's husband to work out payment details. This was not a free thing that he was getting. It was gonna cost him the equivalent of tens of thousands of US dollars to get what he wanted here, to gain his power back. But Maslin didn't really care about how much this cost in money, because to him, it was absolutely worth it. And so once the payment details were handled, and Maslin was, ready, and the assistant had finished putting all the flower petals out, Mona walked over and told Maslin to come with her. And so he followed Mona, and they went into the ritual room that again is covered with flower petals, and she told Maslin to lay down on his back in the middle of the room. And so he did that. He laid down, and he's looking up at Mona, and her assistant and her husband are off in the background. And Mona's got that big, dazzling smile, and she's staring right at him. She says, "Close your eyes and clear your mind. And all I want you to do is just focus on your desires for the future. What riches do you want to come to you? And focus solely on those." And so Maslin did this. In his mind's eye, he pictured himself becoming more politically powerful and more popular and landing the job of his dreams. And he's sort of narrating what he's saying out loud. And Mona's telling him, good, keep going, keep picturing those things. And then at some point she's like, "Look, I want you to picture riches raining down from the sky on you," sort of symbolizing you getting these things that you want. And so Maslin did that, and he began picturing the gold and the silver falling from the sky, landing on him. And he's narrating what he's feeling and seeing. And at some point he was so fixated on this idea of riches coming from the sky that he swore he could literally feel the gold and silver actually hitting his body. And at that point, when he was actually feeling something, is when the ritual was done. A little over a year later, on September 12th, 1994, the famous shaman, Mona Fandey, glided her way through a crowd of photographers on a street just outside of Kuala Lumpur. Mona was dressed to the nines. She had red lipstick on, her hair was all styled up, she had beautiful clothes on, and as she maneuvered through the crowd, she sort of feigned like she didn't want the attention, but she totally did. So it would turn out the ritual that she had performed on Maslin a year earlier had made Maslin incredibly famous. And in turn, it had made Mona even more famous than she already was. And so the paparazzi, they were desperate to get a photo of her because of her unbelievable fame. And for Mona, even though she acted like what she really cared about was being a shaman and helping people achieve their dreams and to heal and gain in prosperity, even though that's what she would say, the truth was, ever since she had had that big hit, that pop music album that had launched her into the stratosphere, ever since then, she had been chasing fame, and now she had really nailed it. She was like an icon in Malaysia. And so as she maneuvered past the paparazzi and everyone's clamoring to get her attention and to get her photo, she thought to herself, my plan has worked perfectly. Except it's important to understand that, Mona wasn't really famous as much as she was infamous. And it really stemmed from that ritual she performed on Maslin. Because what she did to Maslin is she actually just ritualistically executed him. Except it would turn out Maslin wasn't even her first victim. He was her 8th victim, at least as far as we know, and she just got caught after she killed Maslin. When Maslin was laying in that room and the ritual's going on and he's being told to picture all these, gold coins and silver bars raining down on him, well, while he was doing that, and critically, he had his eyes closed, Mona grabbed an axe, raised it up, and brought it down into the middle of his chest. And so this ritual murder was designed to lead to somebody getting more power and more fame, except that person was not really Maslin, it was Mona. I mean, Maslin did become extremely well known for being a victim of Mona, but it was Mona who suddenly was the talk of the entire country. I mean, she was all over the news and she was beautiful. And so it's like this crazy dichotomy of this unbelievably attractive woman who's also a serial killer. I mean, this is the stuff that just makes the news over and over and over again, and Mona loved it. And so when Mona was walking past that crowd of paparazzi and they're all taking photos of her, that was actually her walking to her murder trial. Every day, she would basically treat that walk up the steps to her murder trial as like her personal red carpet with all the paparazzi taking her photo. She'd dress up in these lavish outfits and smile for the cameras on her way to be tried for murder. And then ultimately, she was convicted of it and sentenced to death. But she was totally unfazed because for her, again, it was all about gaining this incredible notoriety, and she had succeeded. It was like the ultimate shaman move, and she had done it. On the day of Mona's actual execution, she was going to be hanged along with her assistant and husband. They too were found guilty. On her walk to the gallows, we have all these reporters and all these photographers, and she's still flashing smiles and treating it again like it's her own personal movie premiere. I mean, she didn't care at all that she's literally about to be killed. And then literally her final words as the noose is being put around her neck were, "I'll never die." Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you 2 stories. The first story is about this woman in China who goes on a hike into this beautiful forest, and it quickly spirals into a complete nightmare. And the second story is about this small village in Taiwan where this very strange event happens. And it spooks the villagers so badly that the Taiwanese government actually investigated. And what they discovered defies any logical explanation. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, on the like button's birthday, offer to bring the cake. But when you sing them happy birthday, make sure you replace the candles with TNT. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Early on the morning of February 16th, 2020, a 39-year-old woman named Faye stepped out of a convenience store in a small village in China. She was wearing a bright red distinctive coat, and in her hands were a whole bunch of snacks that she had just purchased. So Faye had lived in this village her whole life. She was a very simple person, and she had a really specific daily schedule that she basically always adhered to. And it was, she would get up early, she would throw on her jacket, and she would head out to this convenience store, get some snacks, and then she would either go back home where she lived with her husband, or she would go to her parents' house or her sister's house to pay them a visit. And that was basically what she did every single day. And so this day had started exactly the same as every other day. And after she left the store and she began eating some snacks and, thinking about where she was gonna go next, whether it was her house or a relative's house, she's walking down this road when suddenly she hears people calling out to her. And so she stops and she turns, and there are these 5 people that are clustered together standing at the top of this trailhead. So Faye's village was home to this beautiful hiking trail that started right where these people were standing. The trail went up this mountainside and up into this huge forest where there were all these ponds and waterfalls. I mean, it was strikingly beautiful. And that area, the forest with all the ponds, was called the 18 Ponds of the Dragon King. It was called that because there were literally 18 ponds sort of scattered throughout this forest. And then also the village where Faye lived that was right up against it, well, it meant Dragon King in Chinese. But even though Faye had grown up here, she had never once gone on that hiking trail. She had heard about it, and loads of her friends and family had all been up there and talked about its striking beauty. But Faye, she had always stayed away. But there was actually a pretty good reason for that. So Faye, when she was younger, she had this tumor. And in order to get rid of it, she had to take all this medication that was pretty physically harmful and left her with some pretty serious long-term effects. And even though the tumor, did go away and she recovered, that process of recovering and taking all those medications and going to the doctor, it sort of instilled in her this mentality that she was frail and delicate and that she shouldn't take any chances and risk getting hurt. And so she really never did anything that was even remotely risky or even perceived to be risky. Like, for example, hiking up into the mountains. Too risky for her, and so she avoided it. And instead, she kind of developed this really simple, safe daily routine of getting snacks and visiting family, and that's all she ever did. And while in some ways this did, keep Faye safe, it also made her very isolated and lonely. She didn't really have any friends or do anything. She was just kind of stuck in her ways. And so Faye is on this road, and these villagers, these 5 villagers over at the trailhead, have just deliberately called to her by name. They're saying, "Hey, Faye, over here." And Faye's turned and she's looking at them, and they're clearly getting ready to go hike up into the 18 Ponds of the Dragon King. And they tell her, "Hey, come with us, come hiking with us, come check it out." And for Faye, this was so unusual. This was not even remotely how her life went, that there was something in her that for a second just felt really excited. I mean, she did sort of rely on her schedule and her discipline of doing the same thing every day. It kept her safe. But this sudden invitation from these people, these villagers, it just felt like, why not? Why not do something different for once? And she's also thinking, how dangerous can it be? I'm with other people. They seem really competent. Maybe this is a good idea. Maybe I'll just go with them. What the heck? See what happens. And so Faye found herself just sort of drifting over to these very friendly 5 people and saying, "You know what? What the heck? Yeah, I'll come with you. I've never been up there. I'm sure it's great. Let's go." And so sure enough, Faye and her newfound 5 friends from the village, they begin hiking up this trail. And over the next couple of hours, Faye is seeing a beautiful landscape that she was so close to her whole life that now she's seeing for the first time. And it's revelatory. She can't believe that she's lived this close to this majesty for so long and she's never seen it. This was a life-changing experience for her. And so her mood is just so good. And these 5 people are so wonderful, and they're all chattering and talking about their lives. And, Faye's opening up about hers and her health scares and all these different things. And eventually they make their way into this forest, which is really dense, but they eventually reach one of these ponds, one of the 18 ponds, and it's got this huge clearing and all the sunlight's pouring in, and there's a waterfall leading into the pond. It's truly stunningly beautiful. And Faye's friends, they all take a seat right on the shore of the pond, and they break out some snacks. And Faye, she sits down, she's got those snacks she bought from the convenience store. And they basically have a picnic right on the shore. And for Faye, it was this was the most amazing day, potentially, of her whole life. She had broken out of her comfort zone. She had met these wonderful people who were so inclusive. And here she is experiencing this unbelievable natural beauty. The day couldn't get any better. But as she was sitting there on the side of the pond, enjoying this beautiful scene, she started to feel really intensely fatigued. And at first she's thinking, oh, of course, I don't really get out much and exercise much, and I just hiked up this mountain into this forest. Of course I'm tired. But she felt herself kind of slumping back on the rock she was on and almost positioning herself like she might lay down and sleep. And then before long, it was the world around her began getting hazy, and she could see her friends still talking and they weren't really looking at her. They're just kind of enjoying their food. And then it was Faye just could not keep her eyes open, and she put her head down, closed her eyes, and she fell asleep. When Faye woke up again, she was still laying in that same spot, but now it was dark. And also, her 5 friends, were gone. She was all alone next to this pond in the middle of this forest. And for Faye, it was like immediately this jolt of panic rocketed through her. She starts looking around for these, friends of hers. They've got to be here somewhere. They wouldn't just abandon her. They were so nice. How could this possibly be? But she's looking around and all she can see is just darkness. I mean, there's some moonlight coming through the clearing over the pond, but when she looked into the tree line, it was just all dark and there's no one. All she can hear is birds and insects, night sounds. And remember, Faye is not somebody who would ever find herself in this position. This is so far out of her comfort zone. Alone at night in this forest, in this austere environment, suddenly it felt very austere, and she's terrified. And at the same time, her mind starts telling her, oh my gosh, this whole thing was a trap. Those 5 people weren't my friends. They brought me up here. They tricked me. They drugged me, or maybe they've left and they're gonna come back and hurt me. And so she's thinking like, oh, I'm in danger. I have to get out of here. And she turns and she looks at the trail that brought them up here. And all she sees is just this dark tree line. And there's this cut path through the trees that's basically pitch black. And she's thinking, I have to walk through that alone in the middle of the night. She didn't have a light or anything that would help guide her way out of here. But as she's sitting there panicking, she's thinking, I have to go right now, like it's life or death. And so she stands up and immediately she feels really weak on her feet. Like she's super fatigued still, but it's like adrenaline is coursing through her body. She's got to get out of here. And she starts stumbling her way into the tree line where it's super dark, and she's trying to stay on this trail, but she keeps deviating because it's so dark, and she's bumping into trees, and she keeps hearing noises all around her that she's convinced are these 5 people coming back to hurt her, or animals, or she doesn't know what. I mean, she is in full panic mode here, but just for hours, or what felt like hours, she just stumbled through these trails, getting completely disoriented, and finally she comes to the stream, and she just stops. And she's sitting there and she realizes, the sun is starting to come up. So she kneels down and she scoops some water into her mouth. And right as the sun comes up across the mountainside, there's enough light that miraculously she realizes she can actually see a path down the side of the mountain that she believes will bring her back to her village. Like she's gonna get out of here unscathed, presumably. And so she kind of catches her breath, she gets another sip from the stream, and then with the help of the sunlight, she navigated her way to this trail that she could see, and down the mountain she went. And as she was going down this mountain, she looked down towards her village, and she saw clearly there was a big group of people, presumably villagers, out looking for her, that were right down on the trail, sort of like the beginning of the trail. And Faye, she's waving and calling out to them, and a few of the people in the crowd, they're looking up at her, and maybe from the distance they couldn't really tell who she was or what she was doing, but there was some level of recognition, but she couldn't really tell what the reaction of the crowd was. But she had gotten their attention, and Faye's so excited, and down the hill she goes. Suddenly she feels totally rejuvenated because she's gonna be okay, and she gets closer to this big crowd of people, and she sees now it's friends, it's family, it's definitely her people. But the looks on their faces are not the looks that Faye is expecting. I mean, she did understand that, clearly I've been out here at least for several hours. They must have organized the search party. They've been worried about me, but here I am. Like, they gotta be relieved now, right? Like, they found me. But no, the looks on all these people's faces were of shock, were of horror, not really sure what to make of Faye coming down the mountainside toward them. And then, when Faye got close enough to the group that she could actually make out individual faces, Faye saw her sister in the crowd. And she waved to her sister and said, hey, I'm okay, it's okay, everything's fine, like, come on, everything's fine. And Faye's sister kind of broke ranks very hesitantly, and then she finally jogs up to Faye and the two embrace, and it's this really emotional moment. And Faye's sister says to Faye, where have you been? And Faye kind of steps back from her and says, well, yesterday or a few hours ago, I don't know, I kind of lost track of time, but I think it was yesterday. I saw these 5 people and, we kind of made our way into the mountains. I don't know, I shouldn't have done it, but I fell asleep and, here I am. I'm so sorry if I scared you, but I'm okay. But Faye's sister, it's like she was hearing what Faye was saying, but couldn't process it. And eventually her sister kind of stepped back and looked at Faye and just said, that can't be true. You've been gone for 17 days. Faye didn't really have time to appreciate what she had just been told, nor did the group really have time to appreciate that Faye apparently has shown back up again. Because pretty much immediately, Faye was rushed to the hospital where doctors discovered she had lost 60 pounds. She was horribly malnourished and dehydrated. I mean, they didn't understand how she was still alive. And while Faye is being treated, she began to hear like what had happened over the past 17 days she had been gone. You know, they had security footage that showed when Faye went into the woods because she had on that bright red distinctive coat. They caught her walking into the forest. There she goes. So they knew she was up in the 7.5-mile stretch, which is this, 18 Ponds of the Dragon King. It's a distinctive 7.5-mile plot. They knew she had to be up there. And also because this was around the time of COVID, there were really strict checkpoints of all the other villages in the area. So anybody going in and out of these villages, they'd be documented. And they knew Faye had not gone into any of the surrounding villages. So she had to be in the 18 Ponds of the Dragon King, that 7.5-mile stretch. But despite launching a huge search party into that 7.5-mile stretch to go look for her, and also firing off fireworks left and right to try to get her attention, not only did nobody find any trace of Faye, but Faye would also say, I never heard fireworks, I never heard or saw any searchers. From her perspective, it literally felt like she had just fallen asleep for a few hours and woken up, and here she was, not 17 days. But eventually, Faye would actually go into detail about the specifics of what she remembered about this ordeal. Namely, she would talk about those 5 people, her new friends, who sort of encouraged her to go up into the 18 Ponds of the Dragon King. And she remembered their names, what they looked like, she remembered discussions she had with them, and she painted them as wonderful people, but it's like she just woke up and they were gone. And so she thought, maybe they had tricked her and, maybe they drugged her and that's why she can't remember this stuff, or she didn't know what, but she couldn't reconcile the fact that they seemed like such nice people, but must have had something to do with what's happened here. But after Faye said that, her family, they kind of looked at each other like, Faye, those can't be the 5 people you were with. And Faye's like, why? And they're like, because the 5 people you named and described, they've been dead for a long time. Now, Faye was incredulous, but when they reviewed the security footage that showed Faye clearly in her bright red distinctive coat walking up the trail into the 18 Ponds, there was nobody else with her. Those 5 people, they're not on camera. So the 18 Ponds of the Dragon King is not just a beautiful hiking destination. It's also believed to be haunted. Locals claim that when they look up at the mountainside that the trail passes through and then up to that forest as well, they can sometimes see these eerie blue lights moving around in the trees that nobody can explain. There's a story that, people that have died, their spirits sort of haunt this area looking for living people to switch places with. In fact, when Faye began coming down the mountainside and she looked and saw that huge crowd of people that she believed was basically, her search party out to look for her, well, in reality, that wasn't the case. One of the locals had looked up and seen what he thought was another one of those lights, not a blue light, but a red light. It was Faye's red jacket. He had seen this red thing bouncing around off in the distance, and he thought it was, one of these strange lights, a ghost, let's say. And so he had told people in the village, and everybody was really excited, and they ran out to go see what it was, and it sort of was a ghost. It was Faye, who'd been gone for 17 days coming down the mountain, and nobody could believe it. They were so shocked. And so to this day, nobody knows what actually happened to Faye. All we know is we have her on camera disappearing into this trail, into this forest, in the mountainside, and then turning back up 17 days later. Keep in mind, before this, the longest anybody had survived out there after getting lost was 12 days, and it was this young man who was really fit, who barely survived. Faye was in horrible shape, and she was out there for 17 days, but somehow she showed up alive. Faye still lives in the village today, and her story, at least from her perspective, has never changed. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring this video, and for allowing me to talk about therapy and how it helped get me to where I am today. When I got out of the military in 2017, that was arguably one of the hardest times in my entire life. Even though I was surrounded by friends and family and everybody wanted me to be successful as a civilian, I just wasn't able to kind of reacclimate back into the civilian world. It was like my mindset was still trapped in the military and I just couldn't make the jump. And so as a result, I kind of bottled up my emotions and sort of got easily frustrated with everybody around me. I was mad all the time, but I was kind of blind to it. I actually thought I was just fine. It was not until my friends and family intervened and told me, like, you really need to get some serious help here. Like, you're kind of falling apart. You need some help. And I took their advice and I did go see a therapist. And honestly, that changed my life. In early 2018, when I actually saw a therapist, the thing that really did make the change in me was the therapist was able to kind of give me perspective on my life and kind of show me really kind of where I stand and what was going for me and what I needed to work on. And it really helped guide me towards making better decisions. And today, I still rely on therapy because, I'm in this world of content creation where there's so much pressure on you to, keep your views up and look the part and be happy and successful and all these different things. But I'm a human. I have a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that I need to work out as well. And luckily, my therapist kind of keeps me grounded and keeps giving me the perspective that I need to keep me grounded. And so if you're struggling right now, either because you are, or because maybe your circle of friends and family have kind of clued you in that maybe you could use some help, consider giving therapy a try. And a great starting point for therapy is BetterHelp. If this sounds helpful, you can go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen to get 10% off your first month of therapy. One morning in the spring of 1959, a middle-aged civil engineer named Wu Chiu biked through his rural town in Taiwan. He was on his way home from work, and normally he sort of enjoyed this bike ride home. He would take his time and look at the beautiful temple and all the marketplaces. But today, he was not looking at the scenery. He was in a huge rush because he had gotten word that his wife had become horribly sick. And so Wu is pedaling as fast as he possibly can, trying to get home to his wife to help her and take care of her. But as he got to his neighborhood, he started to realize that he was really gassed. Literally pedaling to his house was just unbelievably exhausting. Now, he was sort of sprinting, but at the same time, Wu was a pretty athletic guy. And so this type of a ride was something that he should have been able to handle. But it just sort of seemed like there was a weight attached to him, like he was pulling an extra 100 pounds or something. But regardless, Wu pushed through the pain, knowing he had to get to his wife at all costs, and he turned the corner onto his street, and as he was making his final approach to his house, he saw one of his neighbors. And even though Wu was completely in a rush, he was also very polite. And so even though he's sweating and hustling, he still took the time to turn and wave to his neighbor. And his neighbor, who clearly looked at Wu, made eye contact with him, saw it was Wu. Instead of waving back, they kind of scowled at Wu, like they were disgusted by him. They didn't wave back and they turned and just went the other way. And Wu's like, what was that about? What did I do? But again, Wu has to get home. So he sort of wrote that off and he's like, okay, keep on pedaling. He gets even closer to his house. And then it just so happens another neighbor comes outside. And again, Wu's politeness comes through and he's sweating profusely. He's like, hey, how are you? And this neighbor as well looks at Wu with this look of total disdain on their face. Like there's something wrong with Wu. And Wu's like, what did I do? What's going on here? And so that neighbor does not wave back. They go back inside their house. But again, Wu really can't focus on this weirdness with his neighbors. He needs to get home to his wife. And so again, with his heavy legs, he finally gets to his house, parks his bike, and runs inside to see his wife. Wu would find his wife in their bedroom, in bed, and she was looking very pale and sick. Her name was Lin Wang Yao. She was 37 years old, and generally speaking, she was a pretty frail person who was sort of prone to minor illnesses all the time. And so, Wu was sort of accustomed to her not doing so well. But as soon as he saw his wife, he could tell that whatever was going on with her was serious. This was not one of her typical bouts of, minor illnesses. Something was wrong here. And so Wu immediately began to tend to his wife. He made her some soup and some tea, but, Lin barely could sip either of them. And Lin also, she had this fever that just kept getting worse and worse. And, Wu was hoping she would break the fever at some point. But, all night as Wu was up tending to her, her fever just kept getting worse. And so Wu, he really didn't know what to do. And this is 1959. They're in a rural village in Taiwan. And so it was difficult to get to a hospital. And so Wu really wanted to find a way to treat his wife at home. And he was just praying that, over the next 24 hours or so, she would show signs of getting better. But over the next couple of days, Lin did not get better. Her fever never broke. She basically stopped eating and drinking. And it was like she was drifting in and out of consciousness. And then finally, after 3 days of this, Wu knew, if I don't get my wife to a hospital, no matter how hard it is to do that, Like, she might not make it. The primary hurdle for Wu to get Lin to the hospital was actually just transportation. He didn't have a car, but he did know that one of his neighbors on his street had a donkey cart, and so he could maybe load his wife into that, and they could get her to the hospital in the cart. And so Wu, he went outside and he found the neighbor who happened to be outside, actually with their donkey cart, and he flagged them down, and he asked them if they'd be willing to transport Lin to the hospital in their cart. But just like a few days earlier, when Wu had been biking on his street and his neighbors had been totally weird to him and sort of looked at him with these obvious looks of disgust, this neighbor, who knew Wu really well, looked at Wu and basically gave him one of those looks, like, you gross person, and he turned around like he wasn't even gonna talk to Wu. But then Wu, in desperation, just says, look, my wife, she's dying. She needs to get to the hospital. Please do it for her. And at that, this neighbor, clearly despite their misgivings, sort of turns back around and says, fine, we can use the cart and get her to the hospital. And so Wu and this neighbor, they go into Wu's house, they scoop up Lin, they put her on the cart, and it takes several hours, but they do eventually get her to the hospital. And by the time they're there, like, Lin is basically unconscious. They rush her inside, and the doctors and nurses, they try to do everything they can to stabilize Lin. But as soon as she was admitted, it was like her condition only got worse and worse. And that night, she slipped into a coma, and then she died. Wu was devastated. He and the neighbor took Lin's body, put it back on the donkey cart, and brought it back to their town. And then Wu began setting up for a funeral service. So in Taiwan, it's customary during funerals to have the body of the loved one be brought into the house where it stays for 7 days before they're cremated. And so Wu, after getting Lin's body back home, he put her into a coffin, set her up in the living room, and then over the next several days, Wu was at home next to his dead wife as friends and family, and even the neighbors who, clearly had some issue with Wu, they all came in to pay their respects. And while this was happening, Wu, who was already devastated at the loss of his wife, as he would listen to people come in and pray over the body and sort of talk to the body as if she was still alive and talk about how wonderful she was, it really hit Wu hard because it was like he was suddenly realizing how different his life was going to be without his wife. Lin was a very simple woman. She was illiterate, she really didn't travel, and she was very introverted and quiet, but she was a wonderful wife. She took care of Wu. She cared about him deeply. She was a wonderful cook. And just generally, she made people around her feel safe and happy. And so, Wu, it's like he just found himself over and over having these fits of just crying. Like, he can't believe that Lin is now gone. But on the third day after Lin had passed away, so now we're about halfway through this funeral service, which takes about a week, Wu was in his living room dealing with this overwhelming sadness about losing his wife, and there's this procession of people coming in and out of the house. And as Wu was sitting there, there was sort of a cadence and a rhythm to how the days were going. But at some point, it was like everybody in the room just suddenly went completely silent, and then people began to gasp. And Wu, he was sort of head down dealing with his sadness, and he sort of noticed the change in the room, and he heard people gasping, and he looked up and he noticed a few of the mourners. They weren't just gasping, they were open-mouthed and horrified, and they were looking at the casket. And so Wu went from the mourners and he looks over at the casket, and there in this open casket is Lin, except now she's sitting upright, looking around the room, clearly alive. Now, at first, Wu's reaction was, oh my goodness, my wife must have just slipped into a really deep coma, so deep that the doctors could not distinguish it from death. And so this is a mistake. Like, she was never dead. She's just, waken up from her coma. But at the same time, as Wu's having this immediate reaction to seeing his wife sitting up in her coffin, he's thinking, but over these 3 days that I've not left her side, I've been with her body the whole time. She's not moved, she's not made a sound, she's certainly not had anything to eat or drink. Like, this just doesn't seem possible. And so Wu and the other mourners, after the shock of seeing this sort of wore off, everybody kind of jumped into action, and they rushed over to the casket, and they very gently lifted Lin out of the casket, and they carried her over to her bed, and they laid her down, and Lin immediately kind of gestured for water. She was too weak to speak. She had lost a bunch of weight, but she's gesturing for water, and so they give her some water, and she sips the water, and everyone's looking at Wu like, we have to get her to the hospital. Like, what else can we possibly do? But Wu, he's looking at his wife, and she's so frail. She really seems like now she is on the precipice of dying here. And he's thinking, she can't survive another donkey cart ride to the hospital. And so we have to keep her here and hope that she, recovers enough that maybe in a day or two we could bring her to the hospital, but certainly not now. And so over the next couple of hours, Wu, along with some friends and family, just stayed by Lin's bedside, constantly checking on her, making sure she really was alive. And, she was, albeit, very subdued, but she continued to drink water and had a little food. And amazingly, over the span of only a few hours, Lin went from basically literally being dead to actually seeming to get a whole lot better. In fact, to the point where, Lin was actually sitting up in bed and, stretching and moving around as if she was completely fine. In fact, in Wu's opinion, it almost seemed like within a few hours, she was actually physically almost better off than she was normally when she was alive. Like it was a miracle how quickly she was recovering. And so by that night, when Lin really did seem like she was effectively back to her normal self, the mourners all left and said, okay, well, I guess Lin's okay. And they left, and then it was just Wu and Lin. And Wu had no idea how to handle any of this. He was just so grateful that his wife was alive, even though, again, none of this made any sense. Like, this is so shocking. But he's just grateful that she's alive. The next day, when they woke up, Lin was so much better that she was out of bed, walking around the house, really excited to face the day. And Wu's like, dude, you were dead yesterday. Like, what's going on here? But Lin said to him, hey, I want to go out on a walk. You want to go on a walk with me, go to the temple? And Wu, he's looking at Lin, still like unable to comprehend what's happened here. But he's thinking, she does seem like she's in great health right now. And if she wants to go for a walk, great, I'll go with her. And so the two of them went outside and they began to walk. And as they're walking, Wu, he's a pretty athletic guy, remember? He found himself barely able to keep pace with Lin, who was like speed walking towards the temple. And on top of that, as they're walking and Wu's like, gassed as he's trying to keep up with his wife, periodically neighbors would, wave to Lin and Wu, and for just a brief second they would chat. And as Wu listened to Lin speak, he began to notice something really strange. That Lin, maybe he didn't notice it before, but he was definitely noticing it when she was speaking to other people. She just sounded different, like her accent was different. It did not sound like his wife. And the weirdness around Lin's miraculous recovery only got more weird over time. Before Lin died and came back to life, she had been illiterate. But now, she was not only able to read, but she could also read and speak fluent Mandarin, a language she didn't know before she died. Also, Lin used to be a really skilled cook who loved cooking meat dishes in particular. But now that Lin has recovered, she no longer wanted to eat meat. She said she was a vegetarian and basically stopped cooking. Also, Lin began speaking with real authority about the professions of accounting and bookkeeping. And then also she advised her husband to quit his job as an engineer and open up a building materials shop in town because there was a real need for it and he'd make real money that way. And believe it or not, like Wu, he doesn't understand what's going on with his wife, but she really seemed like a force to be reckoned with now. And however she had gained all this extra knowledge, it really seemed like she was sharp these days. And so he was like, all right. And he quits his job as an engineer, opens up this building materials shop, and really quickly, he and his wife began making real money, more money than they had ever made before. And while all this was happening, Wu and Lin became the biggest curiosity in town. The story of how Lin had miraculously come back to life with all these bizarre personality changes, not only was that spreading all around town, but it eventually spread all across the country. It was like everybody was talking about Lin. In fact, this story spread so far that it eventually reached the Taiwanese government. And when they heard about it, they were so intrigued, they decided they would investigate. And so on March 17th, 1962, the Taiwanese government sent for Lin. And Lin was very happy to go. She was ready to tell her story and answer any questions they had. This was all just kind of exciting. The idea that the government wanted to know how she had made this unbelievable recovery. And so the government, they scoop her up and they bring her to this army hospital and they tell her she's going to be meeting with the chief physician there. And so the chief physician, he's inside of the room, he's waiting for Lin. He's never met her before. He's only been told roughly what the story is. There's this woman who's acting really funny after coming back from the dead, and okay, fine, I'm going to talk to her and see what's going on. And so Lin, she walks in the room and the chief physician, he looks at her, she's an ordinary looking woman, and she walks over to him, and before he can even begin a line of questioning, Lin looks at him like with a double take, like there's a moment of recognition, and she says to the chief physician, "Uncle?" And the chief physician is like, why are you calling me uncle? And then Lynn would go on to explain why she had just called him uncle. And the chief physician was so shocked by her story that he left the room and he called for his wife. And then when his wife came to the hospital, he didn't tell her what was going on. He just said, come with me. She walks into the room with the chief physician, he and his wife, and Lynn, who's never met this woman, and the woman has never met Lynn, they see each other for the first time, and Lynn looks at her and just goes, Auntie. And it was at this point that Lynn revealed to the chief physician and his wife that Lynn really was not her name. That's what people called her, but that wasn't who she was. Her real name was Zhu Shua, and the chief physician and his wife literally couldn't believe it, because they had not given any information about their personal lives to Lynn. They've only listened to her story, and she's just offered up what she claims her name is. She's called them uncle and auntie, and wouldn't you know it, the chief physician and his wife, they did have a niece whose name was Zhu Shua, and a year earlier, she, their niece, had gone missing. She'd gone missing during the Chinese Civil War, and she had been presumed dead, but nobody had ever found her body. According to Lynn, Zhu did die during that war. She was robbed and murdered by a group of fishermen. And then after she was killed, her spirit was sort of stuck in this purgatory for some time. But then, a year after Zhu's death, when Lynn died, Lynn said that Zhu's spirit entered Lynn's body, and thus, she came back to life, Zhu did, but in a different body. And so Lynn basically was telling the chief physician and his wife that she was Zhu. She had been reincarnated in Lynn's body. And as crazy as this story sounded, the chief physician and his wife couldn't help but notice that as Lynn was speaking, her accent was exactly like Zhu's. In fact, just generally speaking, Lynn was acting exactly like their niece. She really did seem like the reincarnated version of Zhu. And then when they dug deeper and spoke more to Lynn and also her husband Wu, the physician and his wife learned that, Lynn, when she woke up and was reincarnated, suddenly she was a vegetarian, just like Zhu. Suddenly, Lynn was interested in accounting and bookkeeping. Well, that was something that Zhu was interested in. And also, the biggest one was that Lynn had been illiterate, but then she wakes up and suddenly she reads and speaks Mandarin fluently, the language that Zhu read and spoke. And so the chief physician, he couldn't help but start to believe that maybe Lynn was telling the truth here. Maybe this really was his niece's reincarnated spirit. And so, as sort of strange as it was, he told the Taiwanese government that, you know what, there's something weird happening here, and, I can't help but believe that maybe there's some truth to this story. But if we really want to pressure test it, Lynn claims that she knows who killed my niece. Like, she knows who killed her, because now she's Zhu. She said it was this particular group of fishermen. And actually, Lynn had given the names of these fishermen that apparently robbed and killed Zhu. And so the chief physician told the government, why don't we investigate my niece's disappearance as a murder and go talk to those fishermen and see if that holds up. And so that's what the government did. They tracked these fishermen down, but unfortunately, only one of them was still alive. But they interviewed this guy, and Lynn would actually say that particular fisherman, he was not one of the aggressors. He was actually the only fisherman in the group who tried to save Zhu, even though obviously she did get killed, but that fisherman had tried to stop what was happening to her. And when the government talked to him, he would say that yes, unfortunately, she was killed, and I did try to stop it, but I just couldn't. Keep in mind, this fisherman had not been given any information. This is entirely like a brand new investigation. He has no idea what they know. But he basically exactly mirrored what Lynn said happened. And so based on this, they actually closed Zhu Shua's case. It was labeled a disappearance. They changed it to a murder, and they labeled her killers as the fishermen who were deceased at the time. But they were labeled as her killers, and they closed the case based entirely on, a reincarnated spirit's testimony. And there's one more thing. Back in the beginning of the story, when Wu is hustling home, biking as fast as he can to get to his sick wife, and he has those weird encounters with his neighbors, well, it would turn out when those neighbors were interviewed, they would say that the reason they gave those looks to Wu, those looks of disgust and disdain, is because, one, they knew Wu was married to Lynn, and they were also aware that she was sick in bed. But here comes Wu pedaling up the road, and he's got this woman sitting on the back of his bike that is clearly not his wife. And so everyone's reaction to that is, Wu is having an affair on his poor wife who's sick in bed. What a horrible person. Now, Wu swore there was no woman on his bike, but he would recall that the bike did feel really heavy, like he was pulling extra weight at the end there. Later, Lin would say that actually Zhu's spirit had come down and hopped on the back of Wu's bike, and it was her basically riding along, hitching a ride up to their house. She was the woman that the neighbors were seeing. But Wu, he was so focused on getting home, even though he felt that heavy weight, he never turned around, and so he didn't see her. And then once Lin passed away, Zhu's spirit, who was now at the home, sort of waiting for this to happen, she switched places with her. For the rest of her life, Lin would live as Zhu, and she would become a community and spiritual leader. And she would pass away in 2018 at the age of 97, and at her funeral, there would be banners hung that actually said both names, Lin and Zhu. And so if reincarnation is real, this story might just be one of the most credible cases ever recorded. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In today's episode, I'm going to tell you two stories. The first story you're going to hear is about this village in Africa where people keep turning up dead and nobody knows why, until they do a stakeout. And the second and final story you'll hear is about this remote island in the Arctic region of northern Canada where these indigenous hunters make a truly disturbing discovery. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to do the like button's grocery shopping, but don't tell them you've squirted an entire bottle of lime juice into their fresh milk. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. In the middle of the night on March 7th, 2005, a 64-year-old man named John Mangine crouched in the bushes in his little village in Uganda. Several of John's friends and neighbors were also crouching in bushes nearby, and everyone was being totally silent, constantly scanning the area, looking for movement. But so far, nothing had happened, and everyone was totally exhausted and terrified. So John had been around for a long time. He had 9 kids, 31 grandkids, and he remembered a time that was not even that long ago when this village was a happy, bustling place where, families and kids could play in harmony and everyone felt safe. But that all changed 14 years earlier in 1991. Because starting in that year, people in this village started dying. Or more specifically, people in this village started getting killed by someone they didn't know. It was like randomly people would just go missing and then turn up horribly mutilated and deceased, or people just vanished and were never seen again. Over the course of these 14 years, 83 people from this village had been killed and nobody knew why. And 83 people, to put this in perspective, represented 10% of this entire village's population. This was so widespread that everybody in John's village personally knew someone who had been killed by whatever was plaguing this village. And at some point, the people in this village began to think that clearly a demon is responsible for this. I mean, this is so pervasive that this can't be an animal or a person. This is like, God's will or something, or this is, the devil's will. We don't know, but it's supernatural. Like, we can't control this. It just is a part of living here. And so literally this village, the people here, had just grown to accept that, yep, sometimes people just turn up mutilated and dead. There's nothing we can do about it. We just got to live with it. But John, he personally knew several people who had been killed, and he never took the stance of, well, it's supernatural and we can't do anything about it. John's like, no, we need to look into this. There's gotta be an actual explanation for what's happening here. And so finally, in 2005, the tipping point was a little boy went missing in the village one morning, And for John, I mean, he has all these grandkids, including a bunch of little boys, and he saw this little boy go missing and, he was never found again. And John's thinking, that's just like one of my grandkids. This has to stop. We gotta look now. We have to look into this now. And so John very forcefully rounded up some people in the village, his friends and neighbors and others, and he told them, tonight we are going to set up a stakeout and stay out all night if we have to, and wait for this demon, this creature, this person, whoever it is. We are gonna catch them in the act and put an end to this thing. And because John was so motivated, so enthusiastic, and so ready to sort of lead this thing, he really quickly turned the tide of people's opinions in this village. It's like they went from being, oh, we can't do anything about it, to, you know what, yeah, let's put an end to this thing. And so sure enough, that night, John and all these people he had got together for this stakeout, they headed to this area in their village called the Butchery. They had named it that because the majority of the 83 people who had been killed and mutilated and, turned up dead, they were either found roughly in that area, or that's where they were last seen before they vanished. And the Butchery was actually basically right next to this lake, this placid lake that sort of sat right next to the village. So everybody's scared of this lake and this area, but tonight's the night. They're gonna figure out what's happening in this village. And so John and the other volunteers, they make their way over to the Butchery, and they each climb into these tall bushes, these reeds that are right next to the lake, and they all crouch down, kind of keeping their eyes on the land, the Butchery, and also the lake. And there they sat. All of them constantly looking at each other, maintaining eye contact, to stay safe. And they're looking at each other, they're looking at the water, the black water that's totally still, and there's nothing on land, it's still, it's silent. And for hours, they just sat there nervously watching, waiting for something to happen. They didn't know what it was gonna be. They didn't know if, one of the volunteers in the stakeout was suddenly gonna be ripped away by this demon or whatever it was. But all night, on this first night of the stakeout, they're waiting and watching on edge, and nothing happens. And so John the next morning says, we gotta do it again. We gotta go back out there and do another stakeout because we know there's something out there. And so sure enough, night 2 rolls around, and now they have even more volunteers. They're motivated, they're out there in the bushes, waiting, watching the lake, watching the land, but nothing happens again. And this cycle continues for 4 more days where nothing happens. John is rallying people every night to keep going back out there, but the group is getting more and more tired. I mean, they're staying out all night. It's also sort of deflating to realize that, it looks like we don't have control over whatever's happening here. Like, we can't catch this thing. We don't even know what it is. And so after 6 days of this, where they have seen nothing, no one's been taken, no one's been killed, it's been totally quiet in the village, John rallies the people one more time. He goes, one more night, give me one more, I know we're gonna catch something. And so he got the village to kind of agree to go out for one more night. And this night, unlike the others, John decided to do something different to try to sort of entice, whatever this creature or person or whoever it was, whatever it was, to entice them out of hiding. He and the villagers strung up all this organ meat in the trees right near the Butchery, believing that, whoever was killing these people was seeking their meat. And so they put meat up in the trees. And so that night, the 7th night, John and the others, after putting their organ meat in the trees, they crouch down in the bushes, waiting and watching, and it's silent and it's dark. And at first, nothing happens. And as the night goes on, people are starting to think, it's just another night where nothing's gonna happen. And people are starting to get restless, and John's telling them, be quiet, stay still, we gotta wait, we gotta watch, see what happens. Hours and hours go by, nothing. But then, between 4 or 5 in the morning, it's still dark out, the water's black, it's still and silent, and people are really starting to get restless at this point. They begin to hear something. It's like this low grumbling sound that appears to be coming from the lake, but it's hard to tell. The lake was pretty big and it was still dark out. They're looking out at the water and it's just dark, and they're right near the water. And so they're hearing this rumbling sound, and everyone's kind of looking out like this is the first time anything has happened during one of these stakeouts. And John, he's telling them, stay down, stay quiet. And they're looking out at the water, and it's still. But this rumbling, growling sound, it starts getting louder and louder and louder. It's so loud at a certain point that John, he can feel his body literally trembling from the sound. And as that begins to happen, even with the minimal light, they're looking out at the black water, and they notice ripples on the surface of the water. something's moving in the lake. And so everybody's looking and waiting, everyone's scared. John looks over at the other people who are in the other set of bushes right near him, and he can see their eyes are wide, they're terrified, but everyone's looking out at the water. And then eventually this massive, dark silhouette emerges from the lake, and this loud growl fills the air and everyone's frozen, and then whatever it is charges towards John. But it doesn't go after John. This huge creature runs past John and bites down on the meat dangling from the trees. But the meat, they had placed hooks in the meat like a trap. And as soon as this thing bit onto the meat, it got snared in one of the traps and it couldn't move. And John, who had been waiting for this moment, even though he has no idea what's happened here, he knew he needed backup. And so he got up and sprinted into the village and began screaming for everyone to come out here and help us. And so 50 villagers came pouring out of their homes, and they all descended on the tree with all the organ meat and this huge creature dangling and thrashing from the trap. And they suddenly realized that what had been plaguing their village was not a demon. It was instead the largest saltwater crocodile ever found in Uganda. This crocodile was 16 feet long, over 2,000 pounds. I mean, this thing is massive. And for 14 years, this crocodile had been sneaking into the village, grabbing people, and dragging them back to the lake. And nobody had seen it. Or more specifically, anyone who had seen this crocodile, this beast, did not live to tell the tale. Authorities were quickly called to the village, and they wouldn't allow the villagers to kill this crocodile as much as they wanted to. Instead, the crocodile was relocated. Last year, we launched a brand new podcast here at Ballen Studios called Redacted, Declassified Mysteries with Luke LaManna. And so far, you guys have loved it. And in case you haven't heard, we also launched a YouTube channel for Redacted, where you can not only listen to these episodes, but also watch the beautiful animations we've done for each of these episodes. That channel already has 150,000 subscribers, and it's growing really quickly, and there are hours of content available right now for you to binge. New uploads to this YouTube channel will be every single Tuesday. All you have to do is look up @Redacted Mysteries on YouTube, and I'll also be putting a link in the description below. Wondery Plus subscribers can also watch Redacted on the Wondery app. Okay, back to the stories. One morning in April of 1848, a group of men were walking towards the coast of King William Island, which is an island located in the freezing Arctic region of northern Canada. These men were members of the Inuit people, who are indigenous to King William Island. And today, they were going hunting. Specifically, they were making their way towards the coastline to see if they could find any seals that they could hunt and kill for food and for clothing. However, even though technically the coastline was right in front of them, they couldn't actually see the water because there was this huge icy hill that obstructed their view. So in order to look down to the water, they would have to crest that hill and then look down. As these hunters got closer to the hill, the youngest of the hunters broke from the group and ran up the hill to basically get an early look over and see if he could spot any animals down below. However, as soon as he crested the hill and scanned the coastline, again, you got a picture, it's snowy, icy outside, it's below 0 degrees. I mean, you're in the Arctic wild here. He's looking down, and at first, all he sees is just white, just snow, ice. But he sees something else. And as he's looking at it, he can't even understand what he's seeing. Like, it doesn't make sense. It's not computing. And so at this point, the young hunter kind of ducked down on this side of the hill, kind of away and out of view of the ocean, and he turned and signaled to the other hunters to get up here and take a look. And so the other hunters, they don't really understand what's happening here, but they can see, there's some urgency coming from this young hunter. And so they run up the hill as well, and all together, all at once, they kind of peer up and over the hill again, and they look down, and for a second, they all just stared in horrified silence. Down below, wandering along the coastline, were not seals or walruses or any other animals that these hunters might have expected to see out here. Instead, they saw people. Specifically, they saw Kalunat, which is their word for white men. But these men were not acting like people. They were lumbering, almost like they weren't in control of their bodies. They had these strange, jerky movements, and they were all just kind of staring straight ahead with these vacant expressions. And their skin, it was like black and blue, and their clothes were tattered, and they were just kind of lumbering along, about 40 of these Kalunat, these white men. Now, for these hunters, I mean, they really didn't have much exposure or experience around Kalunat, around white men. I mean, all they really knew at the time and in this part of the world is that white men were pretty dangerous to the indigenous people. But they did know there was a group of Kalunat who were staying on a ship that was off the coast of King William Island, and they had been living there for the better part of a year, and it seemed like their ship might have frozen off the coast, and they were just kind of trapped until the warmer months came around and they could sail away. But to this point, the Inuit people really had not seen or interacted with any of those white people. They had just kind of kept to themselves, and that was it. So just to see the Kalunat, the white people, on land, that alone was really shocking. Like, what happened? Why did they leave their ship? Why are they here? But again, the way they were moving and how they looked, it seemed wrong. Like there was something wrong with these people. Like there's more to this story than the Inuit people understand. And it was sort of terrifying. And on top of just the way they were moving, there was something else these Kalunat were doing. In addition to these men just kind of lumbering along the coastline, a few of them were dragging this big sled. And there was a tarp over the sled. Clearly something big or several things were under this tarp. But the Inuit hunters, they couldn't quite tell what it was. It was covered up. And so they're just watching these men in this weird parade along the coastline with the sled. And they really were like, we have to get out of here. And so they ducked their heads below the icy hill to kind of stay out of view of the Kalunat, who to this point, it did not seem like they had spotted the hunters. And as the hunters are sort of trying to figure out what they should even do, they hear this awful guttural scream coming from down below where these men are, where these white men are. And instinctively, the hunters, they grab their spears and they poke their head up over the hill, almost thinking maybe they've spotted us, maybe they're gonna attack us. But no, when they look down below, many of the Kalunat were still just kind of lumbering along, but one of them had stopped, and he was kind of retching around like there was something wrong with him, and he continued to scream out, and then he just crumpled to the ground. But the other white men, it was like they didn't even react to it, except for the men pulling the sled. They pulled the sled right up alongside this man who had just fallen to the ground after screaming, and they just sort of nonchalantly pulled back the tarp, revealing all sorts of bodies on the sled. They picked the guy who had just fallen, and they threw him onto the pile, they covered him back up with the tarp, and then, like nothing had happened, the men kept on pulling the sled, and this totally creepy procession continued down the coast. At this point, the Inuit hunters were genuinely terrified, and without saying anything, they just scrambled back down the hill and ran back to their village. The following day, the Inuit hunters came back to that exact spot, that icy hill that looked down to the ocean below. Except this time, they had brought along several pounds of seal meat. So the previous day, when these hunters had gone back to their village to tell the others about what they had just seen, oddly enough, the consensus became that, of course the Kalunat are sort of dangerous to us and we should keep our distance. But from what you're describing, it sounds an awful lot like these men, these white men, must just be starving. Like the way they're moving, the fact that men are falling down and dying, and they have this, sled full of dead bodies. They're out here in the Arctic wild. I mean, this is a very unforgiving place. And so the consensus was, they're starving to death. That's what you're seeing. That's why they're acting the way they are. And so maybe the move here is you hunters go back to that same spot, try to find these Kalunat, and give them some food, not only to help them, to be good people, good stewards of humanity, but also as sort of like a peace offering, because there was tension between the Inuit people and the Kalunat. And so these hunters had agreed. They had showed up with the intention of, finding these 40 some odd white men, giving them some food, and maybe even offering some help, if they needed it. And so that day, the Inuit hunters, they make it back to their spot, they climb up that icy hill, and they look down towards the ocean below, and there's nobody there. It's just complete isolation. And so the hunters, they go down to the coastline and they see footprints from the day before. They find, the tracks from the sled that have been being dragged, and they just start tracking the footprints of these white men. And for hours, these hunters are just following the footprints along this coastline, in the snow and the ice, and they're looking up ahead. They don't see anybody, and it's like, wow, these guys, they covered a huge amount of ground. Like, where did they go? And eventually, after hours of this, the hunters come upon this campsite, but it's totally abandoned. It's right on the edge of the water, and based on where the campsite was and sort of how fresh it looked, it seemed pretty obvious that at some point, clearly the Kalunat had been camped out here. But they clearly are not here now. But interestingly, the people that had been here, presumably the white men, they had left behind quite a few of their supplies. Like, there was the remains of a fire, and sitting over the fire was this big pot, like a metal pot. And you would think, if you're struggling to survive out here, that you would definitely want to keep some of your cooking supplies. But no, that was left behind, along with several other tools. And so the Inuit hunters, they're looking around thinking, okay, well, maybe they just stepped away and they're going to come back. But they searched the vicinity of the campsite, but nobody was there. The footprints just kind of picked up and continued off into the distance. And so, feeling pretty puzzled by this, the Inuit hunters decided to just search the campsite and try to get some clue as to what's going on with these white men. And eventually, after searching through all the different things that had been left behind, they came back to that fire and that pot that had a lid over it that was sitting right there. And one of the hunters walks up to the pot, he grabs the lid, he lifts it off, and when he saw what was inside, he reeled back in horror. Several months later, that same group of Inuit hunters had hiked miles and miles down that same coastline of King William Island until they saw off in the distance, right off the coast, this big wooden ship. And these hunters knew this ship belonged to the Kalunat. And today, their plan was to break into the ship and raid it, because just recently, these hunters had finally kind of solved the mystery of what happened to those, 40 some odd white men they had seen. Because they came across this mass gravesite, of like 30 plus white men all dead in the snow. And clearly they had starved to death and died from exposure. And so it just sort of seemed like this unfortunate thing that these guys had hiked and hiked and hiked and just kind of fell down and died. But now that the Inuit hunters knew that all these white men were dead, they're like, well, there's a ship sitting right out there that, no one's gonna claim, so why don't we take whatever's inside of it? And so the Inuit hunters walked out onto the ocean, which was completely frozen. So the ship, it's off the coast, but it's basically a pathway of ice right up to the ship. And so the hunters, they walked on this ice all the way out to the ship. And when they got there, unsurprisingly, it was totally vacant. It's silent, it's still. Clearly, there's nobody in this ship. Now, as the Inuit hunters climbed the side of the ship and got ready to go inside, they all had set their expectations to be like, okay, clearly the men who had inhabited this ship at one point, the white men, the Kalunat, they obviously abandoned the ship and, tried their luck on land unsuccessfully. So clearly something must have happened out here. Like they ran out of food, or there was a leak in the ship, or some sort of chaos ensued here that caused them to abandon their shelter and, head towards the Arctic wilds, right? But once they got on board the ship and looked around, they quickly realized the ship was in pristine condition. I mean, there was no damage to the ship. It was practically brand new, preserved out in the ice here. When they went down below, they discovered there were all these bedrooms with these incredibly comfortable looking beds, and there was bunk beds and hammocks with linens and pillows. There was a library with hundreds of books. There were games. There was all this cutlery and fine china. And just off the kitchen, in their pantry, was this massive food storage room full of food, canned goods, all still good, that apparently had just been left behind. And so the Inuit hunters, they're thinking like, how is this possible? What caused these white men to abandon their ship, which presumably was perfect, pristine, provided much better shelter, and also they abandoned all their food, like they clearly weren't starving. So what happened? What caused them to go on land and die horrible deaths? Well, the reason for this would not fully make sense for another 130 years, because it was in the 1980s when researchers actually began to analyze the remains of these white men, those 30, 40 white men who were found dead on King William Island. It would turn out those men were explorers who had been sent out to the Arctic by the British government. And they had been well outfitted when they were sent out on their journey. I mean, they were given that incredible ship, and they were given all these supplies, including a whole bunch of canned food items. However, what these explorers didn't know is that their canned food had become tainted with lead. And so as they slowly were eating all these canned food items, they were slowly poisoning themselves. And one of the side effects of lead poisoning, in addition to feeling nauseous and horribly sick, is it drives you crazy. It basically gives you these wild mood swings. And so like the whole ship, all these men are undergoing these totally insane mood swings and basically falling into actual mental hysteria out on this ship. And so in their hysterics, all these men decide to abandon their ship and head into the Arctic wild to forage for food and who knows what. I mean, they literally were out of their minds. And when they got to land into the wilderness, they didn't find food, they didn't find shelter, they found death and misery. And as they devolved into insanity and men began falling down and dying, because they were starving to death, they began eating their brothers. They began eating the dead men. That sled they were dragging along was not to preserve the bodies to give them a proper burial down the road. It was like their mobile refrigeration unit. They were dragging those bodies along and then eating them. And so the reason those Inuit hunters were so horrified when they discovered that campsite and they looked inside of that pot, well, it's because inside of the pot was clearly a human skull, and that skull had been cracked open as if whoever was tending this pot had literally been scooping in and basically eating this person's brain. To this day, bones of the crew members of that failed expedition are still being found on King William Island. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.